Right, we are in Sefer shoftim. What's Michael Leaf saying wrong? It's 10 o'clock Israel time now. Oh, I don't understand what that means, but anyway. So we're in Shoftim chapter 11. We finished last week. We talked about the story of Yiftach. We talked about Yiftach's vow, what he did or didn't do to his daughter, whether he really meant to sacrifice his daughter or he didn't. And that was a sorry story in the history of the Bnei Israel. So we're now going to start in chapter 12, which is a bridge between the story of Yiftach and the next major story, which is Shimshon, Samson. But what we're going to look at first in chapter 12 is a seemingly not particularly stressed event, which I think is tragic and demonstrates the depths to which the leadership had sunk and the depths to which the people had sunk. And it's perhaps telling as well that the episode I'm going to describe is not particularly well known, and it's almost glossed over, which I think is also very telling about the people reading it. That's us lot. So we're going to be in chapter 12. What we should say is that the events of chapter 12 occurred actually before the end of the events of chapter 11. The end of chapter 11 was Yiftach's vow when he came back from the war. But and the reason that it's put in chapter 11 out of order, as it were, is because that deals with Yiftach and that's the end of him. But what actually occurred in chapter 12 happened before the vow. So it's just to make sure that we've got the chronology right. I'm now going to share you the screen with the, if I can find it. Where is my shoftim? Let's try again. Share screen. There we go. Okay, can you all see the shoftim? Give me a nod if you can see the, right, okay. So, here we are. We remember now where we are is before the vow. This is at the end of the war with Bnei Ammon. Yiftach has been victorious in the war, and he now is greeted by the following. Where are you, Leon? Are you with us? There you are, Leon. I can see you now. Let me unmute you. Off you go.
I see that on the screen it says "and the man," but in the art scroll it says "the men of Ephraim."
Yeah, I think if you look at the Hebrew, it says "Vayitzak ish Ephraim," which literally translated means "the man of Ephraim." But if you look at the next, and it says "Vayavor tzafona," which is in the singular tense, and he passed to the north, and then it says "Vayomru," and they said. So I think that when it's translated "ish Ephraim," the man of Ephraim, I think it means the men, but I think it's using that expression as a collective term for the men of Ephraim. So I think on this occasion, Art Scroll have got it right.
The men of Ephraim were mustered and crossed to the north. They said to Yiftach, "Why did you cross over to make war against the children of Ammon, and did not call on us to go with you? We shall burn down your house in fire upon you."
Okay, let's just stop there. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Anybody heard this words of Ephraim before?
Yeah, Gideon.
Gideon, correct. Let's go back to chapter 8, if you will, please, Leon. Chapter 8 of Shoftim. And you will remember the story of Gideon. Gideon was successful in his battles. And this is what the men of Ephraim, the same tribe, remember Gideon was from the tribe of Manasseh. The men of Ephraim said the following to Gideon, chapter 8, Leon.
What is this thing that you have done to us, not summoning us when you went to fight with Midian? And they contended with him vehemently.
Okay, so there you are. They've got form. Ephraim has got form here. When Gideon was victorious, Ephraim came along and said, "Oi, why didn't you let us join in?" And this is exactly what they are saying now to Yiftach some years later, the exact same thing. What is different and what is tellingly different is the response of Gideon versus the response of Yiftach. Let's go to chapter 8 again, Leon. What did Gid'on say to the men of Ephraim?
What have I now done compared to you? Are not the gleanings of Ephraim better than the vintage of Aviezer? Into your hand did God give the leaders of Midian, Orev, and Zev. And what could I do compared to you?
Okay.
Then their indignation against him.
Stop there a second, Leon. So Gid'on's response was to schmooze them up and say, no. What I've done's nothing compared to what you've done. You're the real heroes here. You've captured Orev and Zev. They were the leaders of Midian. No. You've got it all wrong, Ephraim. I didn't snub you. I didn't pass over you. I'm in awe of what you've done. You're a much more impressive outfit than my schmatty little Aviezer family. You're Ephraim, after all. And he really schmoozes them up. And the response of Ephraim was?
Then their indignation against him abated when he made this statement.
So Gid'on acted like a true leader. By that I mean he didn't tell the truth. So what he did was he appeased the people within him. What do you say, Sefer? Yeah, he spun it. That's right. He spun the story to suit what he wanted to achieve, which was he wanted to appease Ephraim. He didn't want to have brother against brother. Apart from the fact that these were all part of the Bnei Israel, we're talking Ephraim and Manasseh here. We're talking about the tribes who are both the sons of Joseph. The tribes who, which we say every Friday night to our children, Yisimecha Elohim ke Ephraim ki Manasseh. We want our children to be like Ephraim and Manasseh, and the rabbis tell us that the reason that we say that, as opposed to any other of our forefathers, is that they were the first brothers not to fall out over things. So this is a tragic episode that Gid'on has avoided by being conciliatory, by appeasing Ephraim and saying to Ephraim, no, you've got it all wrong. You're the knackers, and we're just nobodies. I just happen to be in the right place at the right time. But really, you guys, Ephraim, are really tip top. Now let's compare that with Yiftach's reply, Yiftach's response when he's faced with exactly the same scenario. Remember that Yiftach became the leader almost through default. Remember Yiftach's early years, he was the son of a zonah, whether that is a prostitute or a mistress, or he was certainly out of the family. He was rejected. He went to a different place. His brothers kicked him out. He became the leader of a band of robbers. And only because he was a Gibor Chayil, he was a strong soldier, did the people come and get him to be their leader? So you can see the kind of person they have as their leader. And what we see next is the problem that you have when you have a person who is a leader and his only redeeming feature is that he is a good soldier. He doesn't have the other leadership qualities that somebody of the stature of Gid'on had, and certainly not the leadership qualities that the previous shoftim, such as Ehud or Dvorah or Barak, had demonstrated. So we see Gid'on's response was conciliatory, and now let's have a look at what Yiftach says. Back to chapter 12 over here, where my pointer is, Leon.
A man of great strife was I and my people, against the children of Ammon. I summoned you, but you did not save me from their hand. I saw that you were not helping, so I placed my life in my hand, and I crossed over to the children of Ammon, and Hashem delivered them into my hand. Now, why have you come up to me this day to make war with me?
Okay, let's stop there. On the face of it, that's not an unreasonable response. He says to them, well, what's your beef? I called you to come and help. You never came, so I'll get on with it myself. So what's your argument? You're now coming along saying that I snubbed you, I passed you over, I didn't come. It's not true. I called you, you never came. And that seems a very reasonable response, at first at least. Now, let's see what Ephraim's response is to that. Yiftach says to them, I'm sorry, that's not a fair comment. You didn't come when I called you, so what are you getting all uppity about now? And Ephraim's response is,
Yiftach assembled all the men of Gilead and warred against Ephraim.
Stop. There was no response from Ephraim. In other words, the verse 3 that Leon just read out, and he says, why have you come up to me this day to fight against me? That was a rhetorical question. He wasn't interested in the answer. He didn't even wait for an answer. There was no answer given by Ephraim. And whereas Gid'on had taken a conciliatory approach, we see that Yiftach takes an aggressive approach, and straight away he lays into them verbally in verse 3, and then in verse 4 we see Yiftach for who he really is. Verse 4.
Yiftach assembled all the men of Gilead and warred against Ephraim. And the men of Gilead struck Ephraim, for even the rabble of Ephraim had said, of what worth are you, Gilead, you who dwell in the midst of Ephraim, in the midst of Manasseh?
Okay, let's stop there. So Yiftach gathered all his men, bearing in mind, I'm sure these men wanted to go home. They'd just beaten the living daylights out of Bnei Ammon. I think they were probably ready for a rest. But nevertheless, he's then fighting with his brother. This is civil war. This is tragic. This is civil war. This is fighting brother against brother. You'll no doubt all remember the episode just prior to the state of the Altalina, where we had a potential for civil war there, with the Haganah and the Irgun, and a standoff with the Altalina. Whichever way you look at that period of history, whether you accept Menachem Begin's account of this, which is that he alone was the one that said, no, I'm not going to fire a shot against my fellow Jew, and allowed all the arms that was in the Altalina to go to waste, or whether you accept Ben Gurion's view, which was that Begin was intransigent and refused to hand over the arms to the Haganah. Whichever way you look at it, through somebody's statesman-like behavior, civil war was avoided at that point. And if you read Begin's memoirs, you'll read there that he viewed that particular decision not to engage the Haganah as the most important decision that he ever made in his entire career to avoid civil war. Yiftach is not in the caliber of those great leaders. It's unusual for us to say that more modern day leaders were of a greater caliber than earlier leaders. It's an unusual thing. We don't usually say that, but you can see here Yiftach was very quick to get involved in civil war. And you'll see in a moment that he didn't just decide to just give them a little bit of a lesson. He really went to town on them. Verse 5.
Gilead occupied the crossings of the Jordan against Ephraim. So it was that when the rabble of Ephraim would say, "Let me cross," the men of Gilead would say to him, "Are you an Ephrathite?" And he would answer, "No."
Okay. So
then they would say to him,
let's just stop there for a second. Yeah? So here we're talking about a situation where Yiftach and his army are on the east side of the Jordan. Ephraim have crossed over to the east side of the Jordan, and the battle has gone on the east side of the Jordan. And now the Ephraimites, having been taught a lesson by Yiftach and his soldiers, are running away. They're crossing back into their own territory. They're crossing from the east bank of the Jordan onto the west bank of the Jordan. And bearing in mind that these are brothers, and bearing in mind that this is a retreat, you would have hoped that Yiftach and his army would have allowed them to retreat. Having taught them a bit of a lesson, you'd have expected them to retreat, regroup, and try and kiss and make up. After all, they are part of Bnei Israel. After all, they are Ephraim and Manasseh. They are brothers. They're the sons of Joseph. But that is not what happened at all. These Ephraimites were running away back to their own territory, and the soldiers of Yiftach controlled all the crossing points of the Jordan. So these people would come and they would want to cross over, and they would say to them, "Are you one of the Ephraimites?" And of course, they knew that if they said yes, they'd get killed. So they said no. But they weren't prepared to turn a blind eye, the Yiftach soldiers. And so they had a way of flushing out the Ephraim soldiers because they had a particular speech defect. Let's read on, verse 6.
Then they would say to him, "Now say Shibboleth." But he said Sibboleth, for he could not enunciate properly. Then they would seize him and slaughter him by the crossings of the Jordan. During that time, 42,000 fell from Ephraim.
Okay, let's stop there. So, one sec, Philip, I'll come to you in a second. 1 second. So, yes, so apparently the Ephraimites could not say their shin. They could only say s. So instead of saying Shibboleth, they would say Sibboleth. Now, where's Jeffrey Glasky? I need Jeffrey Glasky. Oh, there you are, Jeffrey. Right. I remember a story that your mother told me that there was somebody that came from a long way away, a different part of the country, and they came to your house, and your mother, or it may even have been Gran, said, "Would you like to sit down?" And he said, "No, I've been shitting all day," because he had the opposite problem. He said "sh" instead of "sir." So he'd been shitting all day and he didn't want to sit down. Can you enlighten me on who was it and why couldn't he say sitting?
He was a great grandfather of my son's, and he came originally from Lithuania via South Africa and lived in the north of England, Newcastle. And this event was the Pidyon Ben of his first great-grandchild, and he was the Cohen. He redeemed the child.
Ah, okay, so I'm very happy that I hadn't made up that story. I hadn't imagined it. So it turns out that Litvaks have
Johnny, I'd like to say something too. It's Sharon.
Yeah, one second, Sharon. I'll come back to you in a sec. Litvaks, it turns out, also have difficulty with their sins and shins. So before we go to Philip and Sharon, so what we've got here is we have Ephraim, who are obviously the forebears of the Litvaks. They have difficulty with their sins and their shins, and this enabled Yiftach soldiers to flush them out. And if they couldn't say Shibolet correctly, well, then they were killed. And the tragedy here that we sort of gloss over is the tragedy of 42,000. It probably wasn't 42,000. We know about numbers in Tanakh being used in a rather loose way, but nevertheless, it's an indication that was a lot of people who were killed by their brothers in an act of civil war, which could have been avoided and was not avoided due to very poor leadership. So now I'll go to Philip and then Sharon and then Hillary. Philip first.
Okay, this is a typical thing of the Litvaks. The Litvaks couldn't pronounce the shin, but this about 2,500 years later, in the Middle Ages, exactly the same thing happened in Belgium when there was a war between the Flemish and the Walloons, and the Flemish won the battle, and they said to the Walloons, use the word. If you want to get through, use the password schild and zwart or something. But the schild, which means shield, the Walloons couldn't pronounce. They pronounced it as skilled, instead of skilled. And exactly the same thing happened as what happens here. And there were very many thousands of Walloons who were killed by the Flemish.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. Thank you. Sharon.
It happened between Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
There you go. So it's nothing new under the sun. Sharon.
Yeah, mine is a much shallower comment. Just listening to all of you with your British accents, I think of Eliza Doolittle and of all the class warfare that's happened in our time. It may not be military tragedies, but the class warfare that makes people distinguish between one another for very shallow reasons.
That's very true. That is very true. Even with our British accents, Sharon, my northern accent is looked down upon by all them soft southerners because I have a very strong northern accent. Lawrence is wagging his finger, but it's true, they don't like a good northern accent. So you're absolutely right. Hillary.
Hi, I just wanted to know what the word meant that they asked them to say.
I don't know. I don't know if it means anything. Does anybody know what shibboleth means? Elaine?
Yeah,
I think it's a sheaf of grain.
A Masonic term.
A sheaf of grain from Shavuot, Shibboleth, B'Sadeh.
Right.
Shibboleth shual. Same as shibboleth. Shibboleth shual. Okay,
well, that's something else.
Shibboleth shual is Quaker oats.
Oh.
Great. It's a type of
a Masonic secret.
Isn't it, Elaine? Elaine, isn't it?
It's a type of grain.
Use in Freemasonry.
Thank you.
Anybody else before we move on?
Marcel would know.
What are you saying, Morris?
It's also a term used in Freemasonry, but I really can't go into it. Marcel knows, and so does Vicky.
Don't reveal any secrets there. No. Okay. Right. So here we are. Yes, Howard.
This is a very bloody period because in Shoftim Shmona we see 120,000 being killed.
Yeah, I don't think that you were with us when we.
I wasn't. I'm sorry. I agree.
When we did previously these chapters, we spoke about the numbers, and my opinion is that these numbers are not to be taken literally. They are allegorical numbers, if you like. They're exaggerated numbers in the same way as I might say to you, you live in Herzliya. Oh, that's 1,000,000 miles from here. It's actually only about 15 kilometers, but you know, it's miles away. So,
even so, relatively, 42,000, 120,000. It's quite a death toll.
Yeah, well, 120,000 were the numbers that Gid'on killed of the Midianites.
Oh, it's not a civil war.
No, there was no civil war. He avoided civil war. That was the point. Gid'on avoided civil war. The 120,000 that you referred to in chapter 8 is the number of deaths of the Midianites that that Gid'on and his soldiers killed against Midian. He avoided civil war by schmoozing up Ephraim, which is what Yiftach was unable to do. So what we see here is not only was this a tragedy of civil war, this is what you get when you have a boor, a brigand, a robber, a violent man as your leader. Any other leader, as in Gid'on, would have tried to avoid civil war. And even if that couldn't be avoided, he would not have gone to the extremes that Yiftach went to make sure that he got every single last one of his enemy and destroyed them. So I think that this is a even more, for me, even more than his stupidity in the vow that we discussed at the end of chapter 11, this demonstrates Yiftach's unsuitability for the leadership. And as we said many times, this is a demonstration of the decline in the standard of leadership once the Bnei Yisrael crossed over the Jordan into Israel under the leadership of Yehoshua. Moshe Rabbeinu is described as the sun. Yehoshua is described as the moon, reflecting Moshe's glory, as it were. And then we see a succession of almost without fail, increasingly problematic leaders. And we come to this nadir, really, of civil war, where 42,000, or at least a lot, of people from Ephraim were killed, were murdered by their brothers. A tragic episode, which I think bears scrutiny, and we should actually not gloss over this, and we should be very careful that we should learn from this tragic event. Now, an interesting pasuk, verse number 7.
Yiftach judged Israel for 6 years. Yiftach the Gileadite died and was buried in cities of Gilead.
Okay, something peculiar about that pasuk. What's peculiar about it? Any offers? What's odd about that pasuk?
He was buried in many cities. Was his body split up?
Yes. Well spotted, Dave. That's exactly what the rabbis say. They pick up on this expression, Vayikaver ba'arei Gilad. He was buried in the cities, plural. Oh, Faye's here. Hello, Faye.
Yeah. So actually, I learned that he had something like leprosy, and his limbs, as he was traveling around, various limbs and parts of his body fell off, and that's how he died.
Yeah, that's what the Mefarshim say. It's a response to this peculiar pasuk, Vayikaver ba'arei Gilad. He was buried in the cities of Gilad, and the Mefarshim say, well, that's an odd thing to say. So they then propose that he had some kind of illness, which, of course, the Mefarshim say was heaven sent, and that his limbs started to drop off. And wherever they happened to drop off, that's where they buried him. Another approach to this peculiarity is that he was buried in the cities of Gilead, meaning that his reputation was buried in all the cities of Gilead. That after this business with Ephraim, he was seen for what he was, and that in all the cities of Gilead, in other words, even in his sort of home territory, his reputation was buried, and he was seen as a negative. 1 second, Philip, I'll come to Sharon first.
It's interesting to me that he was buried in the cities. My thought would be perhaps there was a funeral procession that went to all the cities, since he had in some ways brought honor on Gilead by being the leader of all the tribes. My second comment is it's interesting that he only has 6 years. He's not allowed to get to the 7th year of fulfillment. He's cut short as punishment, I would say, for being this man of war against his own people and not being a unifier. So that I think that the 6 is a very important number, much more interesting even than the cities being plural of Gilead.
That's interesting, isn't it? Okay, I hadn't thought of that. That's very interesting. 7 is the complete cycle, as you say. So 6 years, he didn't complete a full cycle. Whether there was a burial procession, nobody seems to say that there was a burial procession because of his bringing glory to Gilad. But I suppose that could be the meaning. He was buried in the cities of Gilad. Certainly, the commentators are not in a rush to praise Yiftach. There's a famous expression which was quoted before: Yiftach bedoro keshmuel bedoro. Yiftach is a leader in his generation in the same way as Shmuel was in his, indicating that the generation gets the leader it deserves, and the rabbis say that this was a very poor generation which got the leader it deserved, which was a very poor leader in Yiftach. Philip, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I only wanted to ask you, what's the name of that illness where, as you said, that the flesh rots off people? It's not narcolepsy, is it? It's something else.
Leprosy. Leprosy.
No, not leprosy. Not leprosy. It's the
there's
skin.
There's another one called necrotizing fasciitis.
That's it. What's it called again? Necrotizing
fasciitis. It's known in the Daily Mail as the flesh-eating disease.
I knew somebody who died of it. It was.
It's very nasty. It's very nasty. If that's what Yiftach had, well, then no, I don't know. Maybe he deserved it. Who knows? Okay. So now then, we're going to just whiz through the rest of this chapter, because it doesn't really tell us very much. What it tells us is the following, Leon.
After him, Yiftach of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons, and he sent out 30 daughters. He brought 30 daughters for his sons from without. He judged Israel for 7 years. Yiftach died and was buried in Bethlehem.
Let's stop there for a moment. Let's take up Sharon's point. Yiftach, on the other hand, in contrast to Yiftach, who only managed 6 years, he did manage the 7 years. He judged Israel for 7 years. There doesn't seem to be any wars that he fought. He came from Bethlehem, and he was buried in Bethlehem. Let me see if you can think laterally now. There was another story which took place at the time of the shoftim, although we haven't yet discussed it, not in Sefer shoftim at least. There was another story that took place in the time of the shoftim, the time of the judges, which involved the city of Bethlehem. Any offers? I'll come to you in a minute, David. I knew you'd know. Let me see if somebody else knows it first. Anybody else coming to suggest this? Okay. David?
Ruth,
correct. The story of Ruth. You will remember the story of Ruth begins as follows. I'm reading from Megillat Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1. Vayihi bimei shvot hashoftim. And it was in the time when the judges judged. Come back to that in a second. Vayihi ra'av ba'aretz, and there was a famine in the land. Vayelech ish mi bet lechem Yehuda, and a man went from this place called Bet Lechem in the territory of Yehuda, Lagur Bisnei Moav, to go and sojourn in the fields of Moav. Hu v'ishto Oshnei Vanav, he and his wife and his 2 sons. V'shem ha'ish Elimelech, the name was Elimelech. That's Dickie's name. Is that right, Dickie? All right, Elimelech.
David Elimelech, that's me.
David Elimelech, yeah. Elimelech, and his wife's name is Shem Ishto Naomi. So that's how the Megillat Ruth begins. Megillat Ruth took place at the time of the judges. We're not told which judge was judging at that time. We're just told it took place at some point during the period of shoftim, which lasted around about 350 years. And we're told that the whole story took place in Beit Lechem. Now, we know that this fellow Elimelech didn't last very long. He died when he went to Moab pretty quickly, as did his sons. And you'll all know the story of Megillat Ruth. Naomi comes back to Beit Lechem with Ruth in tow, and we have the whole story of Ruth going to the threshing floor and meeting Boaz. And Boaz, of course, becomes the husband of Ruth and becomes the ancestor of David HaMelech, which is why we read Megillat Ruth on Shavuot. Now, the Gemara in Bava Batra suggests that Boaz was none other than our judge here, Yiftach. The Gemara suggests that Boaz and Yiftach were the same person, that Yiftach was another name for Boaz. They don't bring any proof in the Gemara for that. It's a statement which I think is based on circumstantial evidence. From the Megillat Ruth, you can see the importance of Boaz. Boaz was clearly an important man. He was head of the Beit Din. He was a wealthy man. He was clearly a guy who was in charge. Yiftach they say that Yiftach was Boaz, I think purely on the basis that it's a decent bet that Boaz was a person of great importance at that time. We know that he was the most important person in Beit Lechem at that time. Yiftach here, in this particular period of time, was the judge, and he was from Beit Lechem and was buried in Beit Lechem. And so the Gemara, I think, puts a little bit of evidence together and says that probably Boaz was Yiftach. And he had 30 sons and 30 daughters. We're not really interested in any of them except the one that ends up with David HaMelech. Yes, Elaine?
I thought that Boaz, he died soon after the first child was born. So how could it be?
He died soon after the birth of Ruth's child. That's not to say he didn't have 60 children before he met Ruth. Remember, he wasn't a young man when he met Ruth. We were never told that he was a bachelor when he met Ruth. So I think that, yes, you're right in remembering that detail, but I think it doesn't preclude him having had many children before Ruth came along.
He was an Avel. He was sitting shiva for his wife.
Is that right? Okay, I didn't know that. Where's that come from, Marcel?
I'm not sure. I remember it though.
Okay, that's your homework. Find out where that's found, please, for next week. Never heard of that. Let me ask David Marks. You ever heard that, David?
No.
Okay. Also, you have to find out where that's from for next week, please. Okay, now, so that's Yiftach. He is given a good press by the Mefarshim. The fact that he had all these children, and it's the way the pasuk reads, what they're indicating is that he had all these children and they all stayed within the fold. None of them became, none of them went, as we would say in today's parlance, off the derech. After him came verse 11.
Elon the Zebulunite judged Israel. He judged Israel for 10 years. Elon the Zebulunite died and was buried in Ayalon in the land of Zebulun. After him, Abdon, son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, judged Israel. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons, riding on 70 colts. He judged Israel for 8 years. Abdon, son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, died and was buried in Pirathon, in the land of Ephraim, on the Amalekite mountain.
Okay, so that is a quick run through how many years there? Ivtzan 7, Elon 10, that's 17, Abdon 8, 25 years. A quick 25 years in 4 psukim. Nothing very much happened. I'll come to you 1 second, Howard. Nothing very much happened there. These people are there, as we've said before, only so that there's hard questions in the Gid'on Tanakh. And we don't really have anything much to say about these judges. There's nothing in the rabbis' writings to tell us anything more. There's no midrashim about them, except for the fact that Ivtzan is said to be Boaz. Yes, Howard?
Shloshim b'nei banim, his nephews, 30 nephews, is it not?
Shloshim or Shloshim b'nei banim will be 30. B'nei banim will be grandsons. B'nei banim, sons of sons.
Okay.
Sons of sons. Nephews would be b'nei achim.
Can I ask you a question, please?
Yes, Nachum.
Are we seeing just one person who becomes the judge for the entire Jewish people, or is there still a Sanhedrin in which he's the head of it?
Okay, good question, and the answer is neither. They are neither. These people, none of these people were leaders of the entire nation. The only leader of the entire nation in Sefer Shoftim, actually, it's not even in Sefer Shoftim. The only leader of the entire nation after Moshe Rabbeinu was Yehoshua bin Nun. After that, they were all tribal leaders. Some were the leaders of one tribe. Some, like Dvorah, had several tribes under her leadership. But this was the problem of the era, the time of the Shoftim, that there was no leadership in Israel. This is what you saw, that there was no overall leadership of the entire people. We're led to believe, as we read it, if we don't look carefully and we only have a superficial reading, we're led to understand that these people were the judge over all Israel, because it says, you know, he judged Israel by Yishpot et Yisrael, Eser Shanim. He judged Israel 10 years. He didn't judge the whole of Israel. At this point, Israel was a disparate group of tribes who were a loose confederacy. There was no federal leader. They were all, these were individual leaders who led at a particular time. So if we take Gid'on, for example, or let's take Yiftach, who one we were discussing just before. If you take Yiftach, his area of rulership was Gilad, Manasseh, either side of the River Jordan, the territory of Manasseh. If you look at the territory of Dan, which is over the other side of the country, and then if you look at at Yehuda in the south, or Binyamin, they had nothing to do with it. Even Ephraim, who was close by, didn't recognize Yiftach's leadership. We've just read about that this morning. There was civil war. So the answer to the first half of your question, Nachum, is that these people were not the leaders of the entire Bnei Israel, despite what the Tanakh uses the expression judged Israel. The second part of your question about the Sanhedrin is there was no Sanhedrin at that time. The Sanhedrin came only at a later date. It was everything here was done on city level or tribal level, and these were the leaders of their cities, their tribes, and at most a few tribes. Okay, does that answer your question?
Was there a center, a spiritual center for the Jewish people at that time? And if
Okay,
not,
the
how did it
spiritual
disintegrate?
center at that time was where the Mishkan was. The Mishkan, the tabernacle, which we've just finished reading about in the Parashat HaShavua of the last few weeks. The Mishkan was residing in a place called, where was the Mishkan at this point? Anyone? Where was the Mishkan?
Shiloh.
Shiloh, correct. Shiloh. The Mishkan was at Shiloh. Now remember where Shiloh was. Shiloh was just on the west side of the Jordan, close to the River Jordan. It's where they...
I thought it was where the Virginian came from.
Yes, thank you, David. Shiloh was the place where they set up base camp when they first crossed the Jordan under the leadership of Yehoshua. So the Mishkan, the tabernacle, has all this time has stayed in Shiloh. And the question that you raised about the spiritual center of the people, the spiritual center of the people was very, very weak, which is why they all went after their local Baalim, which we discussed on a number of occasions. There was no easily accessible Beit HaMikdash or Mishkan. It was all the way over in Shiloh, and it was largely an irrelevance. So the spiritual standing of the Mishkan, the spiritual standing of the people themselves, was pretty low. Dickie, did you have your hand up?
Yes, the Mishkan stood for over 100 years in addition in Kiryat Ya'arim, which is today Abu Ghosh. And it was there until David took it to his city and created a center.
Right.
In
that
Jerusalem.
That was a significant period of time afterwards, 150 or more years after where we're talking about now, where it was...
Right, okay.
Sharon.
Just a thought, and this does not come from scholarship. When it says that these various judges had so many sons and so forth, and they rode on donkeys, I'm wondering if that was to describe how the administration was carried out from the seat of the judge. In other words, that these were the people who sort of rode the circuit and kept the country coherent and in communication, the various tribes with one another. And so this number may actually be an administrative description more than just how fertile these men were.
Okay, so the idea that they rode on 70 donkeys is relevant. Riding on a donkey at that time was considered a sign of aristocracy, not quite royalty, because there wasn't a royal house yet in Israel, but it was a sign of aristocracy. And I have no doubt that the children of all these people did influence around and about. How far their influence stretched, I think is not very far. Remember that each of these towns had their own sheikh. When we talk about the king of Lachish and the king of Moab and the king of Midian and the king of this place and the king of that place, we're not talking about a king who, as we would imagine, Queen Victoria, who ruled half of the world. We're talking about a very small area of influence. So for sure, these children will have helped him administer it, but I don't think that his sphere of influence would have stretched very far beyond his own, certainly very far beyond his own tribe, and maybe not even the whole of the tribe. But the riding on donkeys is very significant. It was a sign of aristocracy. Okay, David Marks.
I found something interesting with this connection between Itzan and Boaz, which answers our previous question. I think you quoted the Gemara.
Yeah, Baba Basra.
Yeah, so it says there, on the day that that Ruth came to Eretz Yisrael, Boaz's wife died.
Oh.
And this bears out what people say, that before a deceased person has died, his replacement is already present, which is referencing Boaz and Ruth later on giving birth to children, which eventually led to David HaMelech. And then is there, Itzan is Boaz, and then it goes to bring various proofs from the psukim that you've just read that connects the two of them.
Excellent. There you go. Marcel, David's done your homework for you.
Boaz actually was the family of Naomi. He was.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's how he becomes the Goel Hadam. But there you are. David Marks has done your homework for you. There you are.
Thank you.
Excellent. Really good. Okay. I didn't know any of that. Right. Okay. So now we have come to the end of chapter 12. We have just a few minutes to introduce chapter 13. Because chapter 13 and the chapters beyond that are going to take us quite some time to go through, because this is the story, the tragic story of Shimshon, of Samson. Now, there is some discussion as to whether the story of Samson actually took place after the chapter 12, in other words, whether chapter 13 is out of place in chapter 12. But the majority opinion is that it is in place, and that Shimshon was one of the last, if not the last, judge before the next tkufa, the next period of time. And if that is the case, then we will see that our overall view of the shoftim descending in quality from the beginning to the end continues. Because despite the fact that Shimshon is, the name Shimshon is used quite often as a name in the Jewish people, whereas as far as I'm aware, there are not many people called Yiftach or Avimelech, presumably because they weren't such brilliant people. Shimshon, his name is used, which would indicate perhaps that Shimshon is viewed with some positivity. I think that the reading of these chapters, as we'll see, puts Shimshon right at the bottom of the list of the shoftim, in the same sort of category as Yiftach. And we will be introduced to that next week. But let's just do the very first verse of the chapter, because it will not be an unfamiliar verse to you. Leon?
The children of Israel continued to do what was evil in the eyes of Hashem, and Hashem delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years.
There we go again, our cycle over and over again. We just don't learn, do we? After the 25 years of the previous three shoftim, Iftsan, Elon, and whoever the other one was, 25 years where it appears nothing particularly exciting happened in terms of oppression. Here we have the same old cycle. The children of Israel continued to do that which displeased the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. Now, the Philistines were a people who came from over the sea. They lived in their main area of influence was Gaza and the Mediterranean coastline. And they were a particularly warlike people at this particular time. And of course, what normally happens when the children of Israel continue to do that which is evil in the eyes of Hashem is sooner or later the people cry out, and Hashem sends them a savior. What's very interesting about this is we go straight on to verse 2, which begins to tell us about the savior. Verse 2 reads as follows, Leon.
There was a certain man of Tzorah, of the family of the Danite, whose name was Manoach. His wife was barren and had not given birth.
Okay, so we're here now at the beginning of the Shimshon story. But, well, there is one thing which is very conspicuously absent from our usual cycle. Our usual cycle is the people do bad, they get oppressed, they cry out to God, and God sends them a savior. There's no crying out to God here. We've got them doing evil. We've got them being handed into the hands of the Plishtim for 40 years. But there's no crying out. The savior seems to be being brought forth, as it were, by Tanakh, by Hashem, as we'll see next week, without any crying out from the people. And I think that this demonstrates again the depths to which the people have sunk. And the Mefarshim also use this as an example to tell us that no matter how bad we get, Hashem will never abandon us. On this occasion, we didn't even recognize that we had done evil in the eyes of God. We didn't even cry out to God. We just were oppressed, and we accepted that as that's the way it is. You know, it's hard to be a Jew. We are oppressed. They didn't even cry out to God on this occasion. It's another demonstration of the fall in grace of the people of Israel. God has to, as it were, do it for them. He doesn't even have the crying out to them. So what we see here is that almost you can picture God up there in heaven saying, "Oh, they're at it again. Look at them. I'll send them a bunch of Philistines to sort them out, and then they'll cry to me, and then I'll be able to save them." And after 40 years, of course, 40 years is a very important figure. The number 40 is important. 40 days and 40 nights, 40 days, 40 years in the wilderness. 40 demonstrates basically a very long time. 400 years in Mitzrayim, it's a multiple of 40. This 40 years is indicative that they were oppressed for a very long time for the Plishtim. And actually, what we'll see as we go along is that the people were absolutely and utterly downtrodden. They were in a similar situation, if you like, to the beginning of the Gid'on story. If you remember the beginning of the Gid'on story, Gid'on was threshing his father's wheat underground because of the oppression of the Midianites at that time. But at least he had the gumption to say, when they said, when the angel came and said to him, God be with you, and he turned around and said, no, he's not with us. Look at the terrible things we've got going on. And he at least had some passion about that. We don't see any crying out of the Jewish people, of the Israelites at this time. Only we see them doing the evil and the oppression by the Philistine people. And next week we will read about the pre-birth of Shimshon, and we'll start to look at the tragic life of Shimshon HaGibor, Samson the Mighty, as he is described. Just to finish off with something slightly amusing, whenever I see the word Philistine, it always makes me smile, because one of my school reports, when I was in the 6th form and doing sciences, to do science A-level, you had to do something called options, which were other stuff that you weren't ever examined on. So nobody ever took anything seriously on these subjects. And I chose a particular subject. I chose English literature. And my report card from school in the 6th form said, Jonathan has been determined to maintain a position of Philistinism throughout the year. And of course, my parents didn't have a clue what Philistinism was. So they said, what's that? And I said, it means I'm a very good student. So whenever I see the word Philistine,
your mouth and
I'm
God's
always
ears.
amused. Unfortunately, my sister disabused them of that opinion, and then I got my due punishment for being a Philistine. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording there if I can find the button. There it is.